Everyone, Tony Costa here from Toronto Apologetics. Glad that you could join us. I'd like to encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics. It's very easy. Just go to the bottom of the video and click on the subscribe button, or in your device, you may have a bell icon. You could always go to the bell icon to subscribe. So today, in this video, I want to talk about a subject that usually comes up with our Muslim friends, and that has to do with the question of the authorship of the Gospels. You will often hear when Christians are talking with Muslims that Muslim apologists would say, who wrote Matthew? Who wrote the Gospel of Mark, Luke, and John? And they'll say, well, Matthew didn't write Matthew, Mark didn't write Mark, and we don't know who the authors of the Gospels are. And they're, of course, basing this on what some liberal scholars like Barterman will say. And it's true that some liberal scholars do make that claim. But of course, we know who wrote the Gospels, because all the manuscripts that we have of the Gospels, every one of them have a superscript above them that is saying who the author is. And so it'll say, for example, all the Gospel manuscripts will say, Kata Mattheon, according to Matthew, Kata Markon, according to Mark, Kata Lukon, according to Luke, or Kata Ioanni, according to John. And so all of these manuscripts, every one of them, the oldest manuscripts we have, and going forward, all of them, Matthew belongs to Matthew, Mark belongs to Mark. In other words, the names that are given to these Gospels have always been regarded as the author of those Gospels. And in fact, the earliest church fathers will tell us, the apostolic fathers will tell us, Matthew wrote a gospel, Mark wrote a gospel, Luke wrote a gospel, John wrote a gospel, and so forth. And so on that issue, there doesn't seem to be any debate. And so the manuscript evidence backs it up. And so Matthew was never known by any other name. The Gospel of Mark was not known by any other name in church history. It has always been the Gospel of Mark. And so it's not four different Gospels. It is the one Gospel, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, and so forth. So when Muslims say, well, who are the authors? One thing we need to be very clear with our Muslim friends is that knowing the human authors of a biblical book is not a necessity to believe in biblical inspiration. You don't need to know the human author of a book of the Bible in order for that book to be inspired, because there are a number of books in the Bible that we do not know who the authors were. We don't know, for example, who wrote First Kings and who wrote Second Kings, who wrote First Chronicles or Second Chronicles. We don't know who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. There's an old tradition that Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote it, and the Eastern Church accepted that letter as written by Paul. And even if you have an old King James version, you will notice it says in the letter to the Hebrews, it says the Epistle of St. Paul to the Hebrews. And of course, the letter to the Hebrews, if you look at the old manuscripts, the oldest manuscripts that we have leaves that open. The letter to the Hebrews, most scholars in the West would say that, including myself, would say that Paul did not write Hebrews. It's not his style. It doesn't begin the way Paul begins his letters. Paul always begins by identifying himself and to which church that he's writing to, and so forth. So usually you have Paul, an apostle, Jesus Christ, to the church in Corinth or the church in Rome, etc. Hebrews doesn't start that way. It just starts off with God spoke to our fathers through the prophets in many ways, different ways, and in these last days speaks to us through his Son. So we really don't know who wrote Hebrews, but Hebrews is an inspired book. It's part of Scripture. It's part of the Bible. And therefore, even if we don't know the name of the human author, that does not militate against biblical inspiration. It's not a criterion that we need in order for it to be part of Holy Scripture. Now, of course, the early church understood that when they accepted the Gospels, they wanted to make sure that it came from apostolic authority, obviously. and that it had to be written in the first century, that it had to be widespread in its reading, and that it had to be Catholic, that is widespread global, and that it had to be theologically sound. And the four gospels flew with living colors, and they're first century. All other gospel accounts come later. They're Gnostic, second century, middle of the second century AD, and the church rightly rejected them. But when we talk to our Muslim friends, they will hammer this point as if somehow you need to know the human author in order for a book to be inspired. Well, if we follow that criterion, then we need to ask our Muslim friends if Muhammad was illiterate, which I don't think he was, and a number of scholars have argued that he was not illiterate. There's evidence to show he could read and write. If we ask our Muslim friends, who wrote the Quran? Who wrote Surah 2 and Surah 3 and Surah 4 and so on? And they'll say, well, Allah did. Well, who was the human writers who took a pen and wrote down what Muhammad was dictating? Because they never knew when he would have these experiences. He would start to fall, and he'd start. The hadith tells us he would start to shake violently, and he would foam at the mouth, and he would hear bells, and he would flush red, and his eyes. He would go through these various tremors and so forth. And for that reason, some scholars have suggested that those are symptoms of epilepsy. That when people have epileptic seizures, and I had friends with epilepsy, they would fall at any given moment. They would go into a seizure, and they would start shaking and get all flushed red and foam at the mouth and so forth. But regardless, the point is, when Muhammad would have these experiences of revelation, or as he would say, when revelation came to him, he would collapse and say these things. Well, it's not like they were walking around with pens and papers ready to write things down. They would grab whatever they could, bark or a piece of bone or a stone or something that they could write down what he was saying. And so my question to our Muslim friends is, who are the human writers? Who are the scribes who wrote the Quran? And some of them will say, well, those Arabic initials like Alif and Meme and so forth. Well, those are, well, some speculate they were the initials of the scribes. Well, again, that's totally speculative, and some think it has more of an esoteric meaning or mystical meaning. The point is, who is the human author who wrote down the revelations that you believe Muhammad was receiving from Gabriel, from Allah? What are their names? And so if we don't know the names of the scribes who wrote the suras, the original writings, the first writings of the Quran, the first printed, or not printed rather, but the first written manuscript of the Quran, who are those human authors? Well, since we don't know them, can we say that we can't accept the Quran as coming from Allah? Is that your reasoning? Just because we don't know their names? I know one of them. You can check my shorts video where you have Abdullah bin Sar, and he was a scribe of Muhammad, and he suggested writing revelations differently when he received a revelation. And he would suggest, well, why don't you write it this way? Abdullah bin Sar said, let's write it this way. Muhammad said, yeah, go with that. And yet he became an apostate from Islam. He says, well, if I can change the words of Allah, then this can't be from Allah. Because why would a human scribe be able to suggest an editorial writing or an editorial remark on what's supposed to be the revelation of Allah? You can check there's a 1-minute video I put on that in the shorts. And so just because we don't know the name of a biblical book like First Kings, Second Kings, it doesn't follow that it's not inspired. Because ultimately, God inspired, the Holy Spirit inspired the Holy Scriptures. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 2 Peter 1:20 and following. And so if we don't know the name of the human scribes who started writing down these revelations from Muhammad in Arabic, since we don't know their names, can we say it's not from God? Then why the double standards? Whoever said you need to know the name of the authors in Holy Scripture? And if it comes to the Gospels, the oldest copies we have of the Gospels have always identified them as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, let's look at something interesting I'd like to discuss with you, and that is I want to talk a little bit about even the names of the surahs, the chapters in the Quran. And the question we need to ask, and I want to just acknowledge some of the material I'll be sharing with you. I received from my good friend, Dr. Bernie Powers in the Melbourne School of Theology in Australia, and just want to acknowledge Dr. Powers there. So the names of the surahs of the Quran, um, it's interesting that some Muslims will claim that these names were revealed to Muhammad. So the traditional Muslim will tell you that the names of the surahs of the Quran were given to Muhammad, that he already received the name of these surahs. Now, just for the record, the names of some of these chapters were recounted even by Christian writers. So when we look at, for example, John of Damascus, 675 to 749 AD, in his writing, The Heresy of the Ishmaelites, referring to Islam, he wrote, and I'm quoting here, this is John of Damascus, he says, Muhammad wrote many ridiculous books. So he actually speaks of books in the plural here. Muhammad wrote many ridiculous books, to each of which he set a title. And of course, he says books here, but I'm assuming he's probably thinking about the surahs and calling them books. So John of Damascus refers to Surah 2 as the heifer, which is Surah al-Baqarah. And he also refers to the Surah of the women, Al-Nisa, which is Surah 4, Al-Baqarah, Surah 2. And he also refers to the Surah of the table, Al-Ma'idah, which is Surah 5. And he also cites a story from another one called the Camel of God, but of course, this is not found in the Quran. Now, what is interesting about this, and I'm just going to share a PowerPoint with you here. What is interesting about this, folks, is that when we look at some of the oldest copies of the Quran, manuscripts of the Quran, like the one you see on the screen there, the Samarkand Kufa Quran, you're going to notice something odd about this manuscript, and that is it doesn't have any diacritical points. It doesn't have any dots or accent marks or anything like you find in modern day Qurans. And those diacritical points are vowel markers, because Arabic, like Hebrew, is a consonantal text. So what you see there on the screen is a folio or a page from the Samarkand Kufa Quran, and you have the consonants, but there are no diacritical markers. And yet, what do we hear today? That every word of the Quran, every letter of the Quran, every dot of the Quran has been preserved since the time of Muhammad, which is patently false. As you can see, there are no markers, no diacritical markers on this copy of the Quran, the Kufic Quran. The only way you know which surah it is by reading it, and you'll notice the similarity in the story. So the earliest copies of the Quran did not have diacritical points. They didn't have vowel markers, which means this could lead to various readings being brought in from the various readings can come out of a word just based on how you change the vowel markers. And the same applies to Hebrew. And so here in the Samarkand Kufic Quran, you will notice there that you don't have any markers. And so when you hear Muslims say, oh, it's been the same since Muhammad's time, no dot has been changed. Well, there were no dots in the time of Muhammad. There were no diacritical marks. When we look at another manuscript of the Quran, the Sana palimpsest, which was discovered in Yemen in the 1970s, I believe, the Sana palimpsest is very interesting, because what you'll notice here is in this manuscript of the Quran, it's called a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been erased. It's been scraped. The bottom text has been scraped, and then it's been written over. It's like using an eraser, erasing a page, erasing the markers on a page, like we used to do as kids in school. You erase something on the page and you write over it. You write over what you've erased. Well, scholars refer to these types of manuscripts that have been erased or scraped, excuse me, scraped and then written on top. They refer to them as palimpsests. A palimpsest is a manuscript that's been reused. The bottom part has been scraped and they've written on top. So if you look very closely at this manuscript, you'll notice there's writing underneath it. It's faint, but there's writing underneath it. And what scholars have found is that when they read this manuscript, the top portion, because there's a bottom portion to this, they noted that there are 17 variant readings compared to the modern Quran of 1924, the Cairo edition of the Quran, 1924, which allegedly is based on the Uthmanic readings, the Uthmanic recension. So there are 17 variants here. The first thing we need to note right away is this basically puts to bed the constant claim that not one word of the Quran has been changed, not one letter. Well, if not one word of the Quran has been changed and not one letter has been changed, then why are there 17 different readings in the Sana palimpsest when you compare it to the 1924 Cairo edition of the Quran? Why are there 17 variants, 17 different readings? I thought the Quran was always preserved since the time of Muhammad. And so, folks, when you look at academic work, when you look at scholarly work, what you begin to see is what our Muslim apologist friends are telling us just doesn't add up. And so to our Muslim friends, the question is, why are your imams not telling you this? Why are they not talking about this? Even Dr. Yasser Qadi had to admit that there are holes in the narrative of how the Quran was compiled. There are holes in that narrative. And so when we look at the Sana palimpsest, there are 17 variant readings. We'll look at a couple of them. Now, this is the top part of the Quran. Now, the question is, why did they erase the bottom part? Who would do such a thing? Who would erase the Quran and write above it unless they were reusing the manuscript or unless someone didn't like the readings that were under this text and they got rid of it and replaced it with a new one? Well, if you look at the text underneath, it looks like that. I apologize, it's a little fuzzy, but this is the erased text of the Sana palimpsest. And sorry about that, the H here. Looks like the H here. Let me see if I can no, I can't move it. The H there has shifted. Apologies for that. This is the erased text, the text that is underneath this one here. So what you see here is what you see in the faded portion. Scholars were able to obtain that through ultraviolet lights. And so when you look at the text underneath, that's what it looks like. And it also has variants. And so the question arises, if the Quran is a perfect text, why are there differences in the readings underneath the Sana palimpsest and the writing above it? If this is a preserved text, that all Qurans are the same all over the world, that is simply not true. That is simply not true. Now, if you want to see some examples of some of these changes, and of course, this is just a portion, you can go online and just look up Sana palimpsest, and you will find massive charts with different variants in the reading. So, for example, in the the Sana palimpsest, and these are all from Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, and there's the verses there. You will notice that in the palimpsest, you have the visible traces, what you see on the left there, and then you'll have the reconstruction of what that text says. And notice on the top one there, it doesn't have any diacritical marks at the top, the first one, line 4. And the reconstruction adds the diacritical marks. But when you look at the standard text today, you'll notice there's something different. They've added a word over here in red. That's a word you see in the standard text that does not appear in the Sana palimpsest. The line 5, you will notice again, there's 2 diacritical marks here. And then, of course, you have the reconstruction. But in the standardized text, you'll notice there's an additional marker here. At the beginning, there's an additional marker in red. Again, in line 5 as well, Surah 2, 192. Here's the visible traces. Here's the reconstruction. But notice in the standard text, they have an alif at the beginning, at the end here. Why don't these have the final alif? What's going on here? Why is this in the standard text? That's a variant. That's a different wording, different letter that is absent here. Line 6, you will notice here again, no diacritical markings here. Here's a reconstruction. And notice that that word has now changed. Look at the final letter here. Very different. Line number 7. Notice here, no diacritical marks. In the reconstruction, they've added the diacritical marks. They have this addition here. But you'll notice that this word in red here is missing in the standard text today. Why is it not in the standard text? Why was it in the Sana manuscript? Line number 10, once again, there's the visible trace. The reconstruction is over here. And notice that you've got a different letter here. Again, line 11, same thing here. No diacritical markings. They added the diacritical markings here. And notice in the standard text, you have, again, the final alif. Line 11, here's the visible trace. No diacritical marks. They've reconstructed it here. And you will notice that in the standard reading of the Quran today, 1924 Cairo edition, notice that word in red is missing. So folks, especially our Muslim friends, to keep repeating the same mantra over and over and over again, that the Quran has never been changed. It's the same Quran, no different wordings, no variants. All copies of any ancient text suffers corruption. Christians have recognized that in the manuscripts of the New Testament. Jews have recognized that in the manuscripts of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. All texts have this thing in common. And so we really need to understand this point. It's very, very important. The other thing we also need to understand is that in terms of the surahs that were given to the Quran, most Muslims will say, oh, it goes back to Muhammad. Well, again, some scholars would dispute that because some of the old manuscripts don't have the surahs. The oldest manuscripts are lacking the surahs. But the other thing we also need to bear in mind is that there's actually a difference in, if you compare the Uthmani rendition of the Quran with the Indo-Pak recension of the Quran. Now, again, what is the Indo-Pak? I want to just touch on that for a moment here. They were not, again, contrary to popular belief, they were not completely settled in the early centuries of Islam. And so you will find that in some cases the surahs would be mentioned, and then in other copies of the Quran, those surahs would be known under a different name. And we're going to see an example of that in the Hadith. So let's take a look here between the Uthmani and the Indo-Pak Quran. And here you will notice that there's a difference in the surah heading. So let me just quote here. This is a quote from the majesticquran.co.uk, and it says, the Indo-Pak version, which you see on your right, which is used mainly in the Indian subcontinent, follows a tradition of naming the surahs based on the central theme or subject matter of the surah. This tradition was developed by early Muslim scholars and is based on their interpretation of the Quranic text. So that's the one on the right. On the other hand, the Uthmani version, the one you see on the left, which is the most widely used version of the Quran, follows a tradition naming the surahs based on a word or phrase mentioned in the Quran. And this tradition, those who hold to the Uthmani position, that is the Uthmani version on the left, this tradition was developed during the time of the Prophet Muhammad and was based on his guidance and teachings. And that's what most Muslims will argue today. But clearly, the Indo-Pak Quran differs in the name of the surahs. So for example, here's the different surah names. So for example, the 40th surah of the Quran in the Uthmani version is called Surah al-Ghafir. In the Indo-Pak Quranic version, it's Surah al-Mumin, different name. But you see, if Muhammad did receive the names of the surahs, and he was the one who named the surahs, um, why does the Indo-Pak Quran deviate from that? Why does it not refer to Surah 40 as Al-Ghafir, but calls it Al-Mumin? Why? If something was given to Muhammad, who would dare change the revelation of Muhammad? Who would dare do that? And so we have to look at this and we have to ask ourselves why. Here's another one, the 76th surah, Surah 76 of the Quran. In the Uthmani version, it's called Surah al-Dar, Surah al-Dar. But in the Indo-Pak Qurans, it's called Surah al-Insan. Why the difference? If the Uthmanic version comes from Muhammad, why would the Muslim scholars who have given us the Indo-Pak Qurans, why would they change the name of that surah? I mean, who would dare change the name of a surah given by revelation to Muhammad? Another example is Surah 111. So in the Uthmani version of the Quran, it's called Surah al-Masad, Surah al-Masad. But in the Indo-Pak Quran, it's called Surah al-Lahab, because Lahab is mentioned in that surah where he's being cursed. So why the difference again? Why is there a difference in surah names? Now, if someone had said, we have manuscripts of Matthew where Matthew is also called the Gospel of Mary, and it's the same text, but we have two different names, two different headings, that would be a measure of concern. That would be a measure of concern. But why don't we have that? Why don't we have that in the Gospels, for example? We don't have that at all. But again, if we did have the Gospel of Luke being called the Gospel of Luke and being called the Gospel of Mickey Mouse, both having the same text but having different writings, we would have a reason to be concerned. So why all those differences? Now, we also know from the Hadith material, that even in Sunan Abi Dawud, number 2307, notice what he says here. Narrated Abdullah ibn Masud, I can invoke the curse of Allah on anyone who wishes. The smaller Surat An-Nisa, that is Surat al-Talaq, which is Surah 65 in the Quran, was revealed after the verse regarding the waiting period of 4 months and 10 days had been revealed. So Surah al-Nisa is actually Surah 4. But yet, he refers to Surah al-Talaq, which is Surah 65. He calls it the smaller Surat An-Nisa. So you got Surah An-Nisa, Surah 4, which is a long surah. And then you look at Surah 65, it's a shorter one, but because it's dealing with women and it's dealing with marriage and divorce and so forth, because talaq means divorce in Arabic. Notice once again, Ibn Masud says, I can invoke the curse of Allah on anyone who wishes. The smaller Surat An-Nisa, that's what he called Surah 65, the smaller Surat An-Nisa. But today, if you look at the Uthmanic recension, it's called Surat at-Talaq. So we can see that even in the Hadith, the names of certain surahs are not the same as they are today. So what does this tell us, folks? Well, what it tells us is that we have some issues with the names of the surahs. And in some cases, they're even worse than comparing them to, for example, the Gospels and the names of the Gospel writers. Because like I said, if we did have the Gospel of Matthew, and it was known by some other name. So if I'm reading Matthew and there's 28 chapters in Matthew, I'm reading through the Gospel of Matthew and it says the Gospel of Matthew, and then I find another manuscript and it says the Gospel of Henry, and it's the same text as I see in Matthew. We got some problems. We have a confusion here. So when I'm looking at a surah and I'm reading the Uthman version, and it has a certain name for this surah, and I look at the Indo-Pak version of the Quran, it has a different surah. Why is there a different surah? It's based on interpretation. It's based on what the various scholars have put out there. And so we need to understand then that when we hear our Muslim friends speak like this, that, well, you need to know the names of the gospel writers. You need to know the name of this person. You can't even get your surah names right. And yet we're supposed to believe on the very same argument you're opposing against Christians about you have to know the name of the gospel writers, yet you're imposing on us that we should believe in the Quran, even though the names of those surahs have changed. So, as I mentioned already, when we looked at Sunan Abi Dawud, when we looked at Ibn Masud, referring to Surah 65 as the smaller Surat al-Nisa. He referred to it as Surat al-Nisa al-Kusra. Surat al-Nisa al-Kusra. That's what he called Surah 65. And again, we don't have time to go into the fact that Ibn Masud's Quran had 111 surahs and the Quran of Ubay bin Ka'b had 114 surahs. Remember, these are two of the four that Muhammad said, go and learn the Quran from. In fact, Ubay bin Ka'b, he said, is the best of the reciters of the Quran. And yet Ubay bin Ka'b had 116 surahs in his version of the Quran. Ibn Masud had 111. And here you have Ibn Masud calling Surah 65, not Surat al-Talaq. He's calling it Surat al-Nisa al-Kusra, calling it the smaller, the smaller surah of al-Nisa. And so all of that to say that there has been evolution, development in Islamic history when it comes to the names of the surahs of the Quran. We don't have that problem with the New Testament. Matthew is Matthew, the book of Acts is the book of Acts, the book of Romans is the book of Romans, the book of James is the book of James, the book of Revelation is the book of Revelation, and so forth and so on. Some call it the Apocalypse. Apocalypse is the Greek word that means revelation. So all of that to say that we need to be aware of the fact that when the Quran calls our Muslim friends to use just balances, they have to use that in their argumentation as well. So when we are talking with one another, let's not talk past each other. Let's not talk over each other, but let's talk to each other and do it with understanding and with care. Because at the end of the day, truth should be our aim. The truth of God and his word should be our aim. And so thank you again, everybody, for joining and for taking part in listening to this video. I appreciate that. I want to encourage you again, if you have not done so, to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics, like the video, and share it with others. Thanks again, everyone. Until next time, God bless.